town in Minnesota is kind of an interesting twist, but in fact that is where it happened. You know, it all started in Missouri. If you remember, you know, the bloody border wars that preceded and were during the Civil War down there, and it was all about slavery, which states were going to be free, which were going to be slave. And the James Younger families came from a Southern tradition, and while they weren't, you know, they didn't have plantations, they did have farms in Missouri and did have their slaves, and I think they might be considered more indentured servants than, you know, sort of the, you know, the caricature you see in a lot of things. But nevertheless, they were faithful to that Southern tradition. So when the war broke out, you had Frank James and Cole Younger joining up with some of these militias that were raiding back and forth between Kansas and Missouri, and really some horrific, brutal warfare that went on. Both sides, Union and Southern sympathizers, but they were with the Southern crowd. And that's where they linked up. Jesse was a little later to the party there. He was young at the time, but on at least one occasion when the Union people came to their home looking for Frank and Cole, he watched them torture his stepfather. He himself was beaten up by the Union sympathizers, so you know, that didn't help anything to ameliorate some of his ruthless passions. He did get involved in, towards the end of the Civil War, he did get involved with the militias, and that's where those were their formative years, and the skill set they emerged with from the Civil War was one of intimidation and terror in service to their own ends. Many people went back to natural pursuits, you know, farming, storekeeping, teaching. These guys continued their outlaw ways, you know, that they had honed in the Civil War time. As you can see, you know, their escapades were quite far-flung, you know, all the way from Missouri, where they started, and over to Huntington, West Virginia. And sometimes they made off with remarkable sums for its time, like $60,000, which in these days would be a couple million. They lived large in between, you know, they traveled a lot, Texas. They were in California. I'm just amazed at how, you know, mobile they were and how they got around. But, you know, they always did it within the context of continuing the good fight for the Solid South. And they were sort of the politics of the time, as they were pitted against the Northeast industrialists and the bankers, who they felt were squeezing the small farmers in Missouri. So they always did it within a political context. But it was a convenient excuse for what they were doing. And even, I think, the Missourians got tired of them after a while. And that's probably why they kept going further away from the center of their world. Mrs. James by herself was a formidable woman. She's about 6 feet tall, minced no words, laid the law down, was an unabashed apologist for the Confederacy, and you just didn't mess with her. And you can see where some of their traits came from. I'm going to step over here, and you can follow me a little bit. These are our cast of characters here. We got Jesse and Frank James. Frank was the older and a little more cerebral fellow who was known to just join us here. He was known to be well versed with Shakespeare, read the Bible a lot, married a school teacher, and yet we think in the end he was the one who murdered Joseph Lee Haywood here in the bank. Jesse was younger, a little more reckless, but charismatic, and people did tend to follow him. He pushed the envelope and was willing to take some chances, but as I said, people would jump in line and follow him. Cole Younger and Frank, these were the friends from the early Civil War times. Cole had two brothers, Jim and Bob, and then there were some, you know, loosely affiliated guys from either their homeland or sometimes their extended family. Clell Miller, Bill Chadwell, Bill Stiles, and Charlie Pitts. Now, Chadwell is an interesting fellow because he was the one that had some knowledge of Minnesota. He reputedly had lived here at one point, knew Rice County or Goodhue County anyway, and so as they made plans to come to Minnesota, he was the one that was going to be able to navigate the territory, lead them in, lead them out, and with his presence there, made it sound pretty simple. 1876, so they've been robbing banks for about 10 years, and the heat was on in a lot of places. The Pinkertons, the banks had hired the Pinkertons to track them down. They were crawling all over Missouri, so this probably looked like easy pickings to come to Minnesota. Some say this was the last battle of the Civil War because some personalities on the Union side from the Civil War had been in charge of New Orleans during that time and was known to be quite a severe commandant of that area. You had the mill owner in town, Jesse Ames, and I want to be clear, that's Ames, not James. But he was a sea captain from Maine, and he came to Minnesota, bought the mill, and it was quite successful. His son was Albert Ames, who was a recognized general in the Civil War. He was at a lot of the major battles, and then was a carpetbag governor in Mississippi after the Civil War during Reconstruction. So there was some thought that the James boys thought that he had taken money from Mississippi and parked it here in the bank, and that they were liberating it, as it were. That's a nice, neat explanation, but in reality, we think our best guess is they really planned to rob the bank in Mankato. On a Monday in September, they went to Mankato. The bank was located in a building that was under construction, and that work had drawn quite a crowd. And then there was some thought that they'd been recognized while they were there. So they aborted that effort, they pulled it off, and ended up 3 days later in Northgate. In the meantime, they came up to Minnesota either by train or by horseback, we're not quite sure, and a couple of them might have done it one way and some the other. But they canvassed the whole area. We know they were in St. Paul, the brothels, stories about the brothels and the casinos up there. We know they were in Red Wing because we bought some horses there. And I think what they were doing was they would pose as cattle buyers or land speculators, and they would, find out, where the bridges were. They'd case the towns and decide whether Mankato and Northfield, which were the easier pickings. And in the end, as I said, first Mankato, and then later they ended up in Northfield. So, I invite you to ask questions at any time. I'm going to go over here behind you. This is kind of Northfield in 1876. We're right here. The bank is next door here, and this is right here. And on that Thursday, kind of a quiet afternoon, the James boys, some came up from southeast and some came from the southwest, and they ended up in a grove out west of town here, kind of convened and figured out what they were going to do. They rode in twos and threes and had lunch at different places in Northfield. Some over here on this side of the river, some over here. They talked politics, they joshed with the local people. After lunch, about 1:30, you had 3 of the riders come across the bridge here. And there was Frank James, Bob Younger, and Charlie Pitts. And they rode up and they parked their horses here in front, tied them up with the hitching post. And then they went down to the corner here and just sat for a while, just kind of killed some time while other people got in place. And in the meantime, you had Cole Younger and Clell Miller come up from this direction. So that would be on the west side. They come up by Bierman's. I don't know if you're familiar with Bierman's. And they went outside. They got right in front of the bank, and that's where they stopped. They dismounted, and they were messing with their cinches, and just their job was to be sentries, keep the lid on things in the street. This was the only known exit for these guys. So then, when Clell Miller and Cole Younger were in place, you had Jesse James, James Younger, and Bill Chadwell. Remember the fellow that was going to lead us into and out of Minnesota. They were here in the square to control that area so they could escape out of the area. Of course, things went horribly wrong. You had the last customer before the raid was a fellow who had a hardware store down here. And once Cole Younger and Clell Miller were in place, these guys started to move towards the bank. And they met this fellow, the hardware owner, as he was leaving, J.S. Allen, and things didn't look right. So he turned around and tried to follow them into the bank. And by that time, Clell Miller was sort of a sentry at the door, and he pulled his gun and told him to get out of here. Well, that sounded the alarm. J.S. Allen runs down the street hollering, "Get your guns, boys, they're robbing the bank." And that alerted all these townspeople, merchants here. You had Henry Wheeler, who was home for the summer, medical student from Michigan. He ran up here, grabbed a gun from the Dampier Hotel, went up to a window there so he could shoot down in the street. You had these folks here who, hardware store owners, so they had guns and ammunition in their stores. And a lot of these guys had had some military experience. You know, they'd been in the Civil War, and they were hunters, so this was not foreign to them. So they got their guns, and they're out here. You've got Wheeler up here, and just all hell breaks loose on in the middle of the street here. A 7-minute firefight that just went on and on and on, and ended up with Clell Miller being shot dead in the street.